Hello, everybody. I'm Dan Limbach from Pharma Voice, and I'd like to welcome you to today's event entitled Piloting the Queen Mary, the Unique Challenges of Cardiovascular Outcome Studies, brought to you by Pharma Voice in partnership with our good friends at Worldwide Clinical Trials. We have an outstanding crowd today with executives from across the industry. Thank you for investing the time to attend. We'll certainly do our very best to make it worth your while. We have a very knowledgeable panel of experts with us today to help us understand the many challenges associated with cardiovascular outcome studies. Based on our turnout, this is clearly a popular topic, and it promises to be an extremely informative session. Dr. Murphy is going to start things off today. Doctor, you have the floor.
Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mike Murphy, and I'm Chief Medical and Scientific Officer for the organization. My role today is quite simple. I am providing a coordinating role for some exceptional experts in content and operations that subsequently will follow. And indeed, it was quite a challenge to come up with an agenda that we thought would sample all of the relevant topics. Indeed, there is a unique order of complexity associated with these trials. I'll be speaking to that more directly. Then Karen Hill, who will introduce herself shortly, will be talking about supporting the future of cardiovascular research, basically reviewing over 25 years of experience, lessons learned, what have been the experiences, what have these studies taught us regarding overall the art of trial conduct. In some respects, the ultimate expression of operational acumen. Where is this heading? And because studies are always constantly in evolution, we're going to ask Dr. Tony Bransford in a minute to talk to us about some emerging novel trial endpoints and the implications regarding the conduct of these studies. Does it change the nature of staffing? Does it change the way we interpret the data as a practicing physician and as a researcher? And then finally, Chris Stanley will be talking about a holistic approach toward the use of technology solutions in these studies, the underlying fabric that holds the study together, the method by which these diverse elements are linked, and the direction in which technology seems to be evolving. We thought we would begin, though, by asking a very simple question. By the way, as Dan has indicated, and over the many webinars that WCT has had the privilege of conducting, I have rarely seen a more diverse and extensive audience. So we want to ask you a question first, see what your experience has been. Have you ever been involved in a large cardiovascular outcome study? And we'll use this to calibrate our remarks and facilitate the experience today. So please go ahead and answer the question. Fantastic. Well, we have a nice audience here that's going to maybe kind of facilitate the discussion toward the end. We hope that you do. But for those that have never been engaged in this type of research, we also are going to touch upon some elements that you may find very surprising in these types of trials. So what is it about this Queen Mary analogy? What is that about? Quite simply, the operational implementation of a large cardiovascular outcome study in some respects would be comparable to launching, say, the Queen Mary. Lots of compartments, multiple relationships between functional services, a requirement for impeccable handoffs between those services, certainly very difficult to launch, as you'll hear from Karen in a second, but occasionally even more difficult, I think, to bring into port. We think the analogy fits beautifully. Some of the complexity, I think, is reflected in the fact that CVOT is a blend on the continuum of pragmatic-explanatory trial design. On the left-hand side, we have explanatory type of research, and on the right-hand side, the more pragmatic part of the spectrum. At the extremes of the spectrum, the distinctions are rather straightforward. Explanatory studies, which will be on the left side of this slide, confirm physiological or clinical hypotheses, while pragmatic studies intend to inform us on clinical and policy decisions to influence real-world practice. And along this entire dimension, participants, treatments, comparisons, control groups, methods of blinding, nature of outcomes, and the data management are all different. As an example, the explanatory research focuses on effect, efficacy, and then effectiveness. Pragmatic studies look at effectiveness and efficiency. Explanatory research has highly restrictive eligibility versus very inclusive eligibility. Those of us that work in early phase research, and many on the phone do, routinely use highly leveraged patient samples, that is, patient samples that are deliberately selected to enhance signal detection. Pragmatic studies, in contrast, and appropriately look at the target population, the ultimate population, where the intervention is going to be marketed. Explanatory research has very specialized centers usually. Pragmatic studies have more representative sites. Explanatory research is worried about measures, and then secondarily outcomes. Pragmatic studies are looking at outcomes, and then secondarily measures. Pragmatic studies are very layered, three-dimensional, hierarchical, lots of different measures, whether they be biochemical, electrophysiological, clinical, and so forth. Pragmatic studies commonly use composites in outcomes and endpoints. As an example, in CVOT, all mortality, cardiac death, major CV disability, just as an example. Our experience has been that explanatory research trials are very difficult to estimate trial metrics. Everyone attempts to do it. My experience has been that it's largely imprecise. On the other side, pragmatic studies seem to have a predictability about them. Perhaps it's the scale of the study that lends itself to that. Explanatory research basically involves writing a dissertation on every patient. I need to know who the patient dated at the senior prom, so to speak, for proof of concept studies. On the other side, a pragmatic study places a premium on data flow, process, infrastructure, the ability to scale. The challenge with cardiovascular outcome studies is that it includes both, and this really is what offers the complexity that we're alluding to today. When we ask, the first thing I encountered a few years ago when Karen Hill first introduced me to this type of study was the incredible amount of relationships that needed to be managed. It seemed to me innumerable vendors, very complex relationships between commercial and academic stakeholders, really a mosaic of interest, points of emphasis and contact, with the contract research organization right there in the middle, providing a nodal point for the adjudication of all of these events. As we go from left to right on the slide, for example, steering committees to assure scientific integrity, DSMB for interim analyses, endpoint classification committees, biostatistical services, on-site field monitoring, and all the interesting variations that people are now talking about in that regard, drug packaging, the investigators, and of course at the center of the universe here to manage this would be the CRO, a partner in this type of trials. So the first observation we have is one of complexity, one of managing relationships, one of adjudicating diverse interests. It's a higher order function in these very large outcome studies. The second area we see, and this is a kind of an interesting observation as well, I think, is they're characterized by studies within a study. This diagram attempts to illustrate this particular point. You see here a collection of different trials that are embedded within the overall the study itself. Each study is addressing a different hypothesis. Each requires a unique design and a unique operational approach. This particular diagram is so appealing in that it not only represents the data set, so to speak, for the primary analysis, but it includes a number of ancillary analysis, such as that light green that you should be looking at now, which is an ECG study, or the dark green, which is a blood study, or the little MRI study, which is embedded there in that small circle. And then very cleverly, at least from my perspective, this particular study, in that vertical oval that you see there, attempts to capture those individuals who were not randomized in the trial in an attempt to compare them, to compare the healthcare utilization and transitions in care, so to speak, to those individuals who were actually included in the trial. So study within studies within a study, characteristic of this type of investigation, in all of which needs to be effectively managed. So today we're going to ask a few questions and hope that we address some of your interests. So what is implied by scalable operational infrastructure? What features of CVOT impact data acquisition and data integrity? How are the interests of diverse stakeholders correctly adjudicated? Some of these studies occur over many years in thousands of patients and centers. How do we manage that for the duration of the study? One of my favorite topics, do regional differences in standards of care facilitate or encumber study execution? And as Tony will shortly speak to, what do the emerging trends in clinical trial methodology for this particular type of research imply for study execution and interpretation? And then Chris is, where's the technology enabling? We hear so much about this. Where is it heading? What might be its contribution to future trials? So with that as an introduction, may I please turn this over to Karen, who will lead us through the first topic. Karen?
Yeah, hi. Thanks very much, Mike. So I'm Karen Hill. I'm Senior Vice President here at WCT and head up our Cardiovascular Project Management Group. So very happy to be able to speak to you today. So what I'm going to look at firstly is this supporting the future of cardiovascular research. So I think those of you who have done this type of research will know that cardiovascular outcome studies by definition involve huge numbers of patients and sites globally and are probably the easily the biggest investment a company will make in cardiovascular research and development. They also require, as Dr. Murphy's always said, attentive relationship management across diverse stakeholders. Collaboration is key in managing these studies, and sponsors often partner with academic research groups and other vendors that have a wealth of experience but also bring other challenges and often their own agendas, therefore requiring clearly defined roles and responsibilities to be established early on. And I think this is one of the key areas that you will hear as we go through the next few minutes. These studies are often not just twice the size of a phase 2 study, for instance, which then would lead to, say, twice the number of resources being deployed. They are more than tens of times larger than that. So we really do need to look at our processes, and these have to be scalable, leading to efficiencies both in time and cost. So due to the size and complexity, it's important to understand like the Queen Mary, once these large trials have set sail, it's going to be extremely difficult to steer them in a different direction. Protocol amendments and database changes, for instance, should be avoided, and study objectives should remain the focus, and only the most relevant information collected. However, these vast databases are extremely valuable and not only give us an understanding of the specific intervention, but also the disease, and are often used to answer other more general medical questions relating to the study population. So let's look at some of the common challenges. So we've already mentioned these come with very high financial costs associated with these types of studies. Timelines are traditionally long, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. There continues to be an increased competition for qualified investigators and sites, which are leading to more global studies, more countries involved, more sites involved. Large patient populations and long follow-up periods are required, often taking, say, 18 to 20 months to recruit, followed by another 2 to 3 years or more of follow-up. A recently completed large study that we were involved in the last couple of years saw the study starting out to recruit around about 10,000 patients. But during the study, we had to look at the number of endpoints and therefore increase the number of patients. And firstly, that went up to over 12,000 patients, and then finally was around just under 20,000. And this study took over almost 10 years to complete. There are regulatory and administrative barriers to overcome, so we need to ensure that the right questions are answered. Studies of this size just cannot be repeated. Sponsors impose barriers, working up front with sponsors to ensure that simple things like availability of their resources to provide documentation, for instance, or more complex issues like do they have burdensome contract language and multiple review cycles. We often find as a CRO that we've got plenty of resources, but the sponsors themselves struggle to keep up with some of the administrative tasks. There can be a disconnect between clinical research and medical care. Dr. Murphy already spoke about studies within studies. Finding the right balance is key. Barriers at academic institutions, I think, with lengthy contracting and cycles has led to us to look for ways to recruit patients in perhaps more typical care settings, primary care and community-based physicians, etc., giving, I think, other challenges as, you know, have they got experience, what sort of other research have they done before? And then globalization of clinical research. Again, we know that these studies have to be truly worldwide now in order to have the number of sites and patients to deliver these studies effectively and efficiently. So, okay, we're going to just ask another quick question. So let's look at a particular cardiovascular indication which has been extensively researched in the past. So, when was the first treatment for a heart attack introduced into routine hospital practice?
Okay, so we've got a few answers in all of them, but it looks like B, the late 70s, is the most popular one. Is that surprising?
Yeah, and this took me by surprise too, because when I started research in the early 90s, in 93, I was surprised that thrombolysis actually was introduced, although fairly quickly, into routine practice, but only after the publication of clinical trials in 1988. So less than 30 years ago. Until then, somebody would come in with a heart attack, and all we would do would be given them a painkiller, basically, and then put them to bed and watch them either recover or die. So as I say, I was quite surprised that coming into the industry in the early 90s that was a new treatment. So in the late 90s, with more than 200,000 patients randomized in large-scale trials over the previous decade, thrombolysis was at that time the most intensively studied medical intervention, which, as I say, I thought was quite surprising. Okay, so now looking at some of the mitigation measures and their impacts, which have been successful over recent years and have made a difference, resulting in some important savings. So, you know, simple things like, I think we've all seen the widespread use of electronic health records improving the way that we can now recruit patients, but also the number of patients per site has been reduced, and, you know, the screening process itself. Making it easier to recruit, also looking at sponsors to look at recruitment restrictions and enrollment restrictions has also brought down patient recruitment costs. Simplifying clinical protocols and reducing amendments. For example, you know, something like an IRB amendment cost may be just a few $1,000s, perhaps in CRO costs, but if you think about hundreds of sites there, that cost can soon escalate. So keeping those down to a minimum. And then engaging sponsors in discussions re data monitoring and SDV particular. I think we've all seen the heightened interest in risk-based monitoring and centralized monitoring. This not only can reduce the time on site and time spent working and contacting sites, but also it can reduce the number of on-site visits required, which can then also be successfully performed by lower cost in-house staff, which again, you know, helps with the costing. And if you think about it, monitoring costs, particularly from the CRO, are often more than 50% of the budget. So obviously some of these things can make some significant savings. And then use of mobile technology, EDC, has obviously been around now for quite some time, but that can look at, we can look at reducing the phase times in years and reduction in site management, project management and site monitoring again. And then utilizing low-cost facilities, local labs, etc., home testing, again, you know, we can look at that to reduce phase time and, again, reduction in staffing. So one other area that I think has had a lot of attention over the last sort of 10 years or so, but even perhaps more recently, it continues to be a big area, and also certainly affects the regulatory and administrative barriers, is patient retention and follow-up. So many outcome studies, as we know, are event-driven, using an intent-to-treat population. Therefore, patients need to stay in the study, importantly being followed up regardless of whether they are on study medication. This has been a huge area of focus for regulators and the FDA in particular, expecting to see low numbers of patients who withdraw consent, discontinue drug, and of course, we lose to follow-up. This is an example of a large outcome study. As you can see, it involves over 1,000 sites globally and more than 20,000 patients, and with a huge number of monitoring visits, but also patient visits and the amount of data collected. So the loss to follow-up rate was less than 1%, but this wasn't by accident. You know, we did involve a very active retention plan from the beginning. All stakeholders, including the sponsor, the CRO, the ARO, were all involved in designing a very robust plan, getting study coordinators and site staff engaged early. It included putting in appropriate language into the ICF to allow for vital status to be captured even if patients withdrew consent. Also ensuring that site staff were fully engaged with their patients, and then also tracking what we call potentially lost to follow-up patients. So looking for key risks, looking at missed visits, for instance, or late visits, patients who withdrawn from study drugs, they were also, potentially where, we might find start losing patients in the study. And then use of patient finder services, things like that, also where needed towards the end of the study. So let's recap. So as we've seen, we know that successful ARO-CRO partnerships are key. This will lead to access to top performing sites and principal investigators, and also helps in the engagement from key opinion leaders. Integrated technologies for streamlined data collection, electronic document collection, leading to transparent metrics is also key, and my colleague Chris will talk about that in a little bit more detail. Competitive investigator fees, as you may think, this is an easy incentive. However, with these types of studies, with these large patient populations, we still need to look at keeping things simple and looking at ways to not overcomplicate what is required by the site. Should be really forefront, and avoid nice to have. I think it's key just to sort of focus on the intent of the study. And then robust recruitment and retention plans that I just mentioned before, looking at upfront screening activities, even requesting sites of these before the beginning of the study with each of the sites, setting them targets of number of patients that they should pre-identify, really sort of making them keep to those targets. Keeping study procedures close to standard of care makes them easier, and obviously there's a cost saving there. And above all, we saw how smart and adaptive monitoring can make significant cost savings, including, as I mentioned before, remote monitoring, flexible on-site visits. We shouldn't be looking at regular visit schedules in these types of studies. We need to go where the data is. And then tiered SDV based on risk-based techniques have also become very popular, and I think they will continue to also be a focus. Thank you. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Tony Bransford.
Thank you, Karen. And I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Tony Bransford, and I'm a Senior Medical Director with Worldwide Clinical Trials in the Medical and Scientific Affairs Department, Division of Cardiology. I've had a career in academics prior to joining the pharmaceutical industry, where I was for a decade before coming to Worldwide Clinical Trials. Thank you for coming to this program. Karen, let me just start by thanking you for that very, very nice summary, that nice presentation, but that is just the start of the story. Companies want their drugs approved. Regulatory approval may be the promised land, but we have many miles to go before we sleep. So, what can Sisyphus teach us? Don't roll that boulder up that steep hill. Now, trials of the future will have to look at novel designs to bring drugs to market and continue to reduce the unmet medical need in our patients. Otherwise, we're just Sisyphus rolling that immense boulder up a hill. Today's reality is that cardiovascular event rates have decreased dramatically in recent years. Now, a patient hospitalized with heart failure in the late 1980s had a chance of survival of less than 1.25 years after discharge. Those patients with left ventricular systolic dysfunction, also known as heart failure with reduced ejection fraction, died either from progressive pump failure or suddenly, mainly due to ventricular arrhythmias. This picture has transformed itself in the last 2 decades. And with the advent of better therapies, including ACE inhibitors, beta blockers, mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists, cardiac resynchronization, and that's just in heart failure. You look in acute coronary syndrome and chronic coronary heart disease, there's dual antiplatelet therapy, statins, beta blockers, angioplasty, and more. We can assume a significantly improved prognosis in the picture and substantially lower event rates. And thus you see here, if we look at our slide, in 1990s, and this is a depiction of what we have begun to see over the years. A significant event rate in the 1990s, and thus lower sample sizes, very nice sample sizes, around 2,000 to 3,000 or so. We get to the 2000s, we have our new medications, our standard of care at this point. The event rates have gone down. The sample sizes, as a result, have had to increase to compensate. Now we get to present day where the sample sizes, where the event rate has continued to creep downward. And we're now looking at mega trials on the level of 20,000 and more for these coronary heart disease trials, 10,000 or so for these heart failure trials. And as a matter of fact, as I recall, Paradigm Heart Failure, which came out in the last few years, was noted at that time to be the largest heart failure trial at about 8,000 or so. So I bring us back to Sisyphus, forever pushing that large boulder up the steep hill. Trials of today have to acknowledge this changing pattern. But the conventional trial leaves a lot to be desired. If we look at the example of patient flow in a conventionally designed heart failure trial with the primary endpoint of heart failure hospitalization and death, this represents that normal patient flow of a patient entering the hospital. You see he goes into a research trial and he has an event. He's hospitalized for heart failure within the first 6 months. Now the trial lasts for approximately 3 years, and during that time, let's say about 2 years after that hospitalization, the patient dies. In a conventional time to first event trial, the first event is recognized, that heart failure hospitalization, and that second event, that death, is ignored. It's not counted towards the primary endpoint. It's not recognized. So unfortunately, that's we lose that important piece of information. As a result of not having that additional piece of information, we don't have the extra events. We have a larger sample size, as we noted earlier. The lower event rates result in, consequently, a higher sample size. That larger sample size is not without its challenges. Costs go up. We're unable to contain costs. As what we designed 3 years ago is not the same in today's world. So 3 years ago, the event rate may have been one thing, but with the sample size, if we were to do an interim analysis and re-look at the event rate, we notice that the event rate is now lower. So we now have to increase the sample size much more. We'll have to prolong the trial. There are obviously going to be some operational issues. We're going some more costs due to operations, due to bringing in more patients. A lot of extra fees and a lot of extra complexity. However, with recurrent events, you allow the trial to capture all the events in the patient's clinical course, and you can reduce the sample size. So you see here in this graphic, the patient enters a research trial. has a heart failure hospitalization within the first 6 months and has another heart failure hospitalization sometime during the trial and ultimately dies. One right after the other. With this trial design, we're now capturing that information that we would have previously ignored, the last two events, that last hospitalization and that last death. The number of events have increased, leading to a greater event rate, improved power. As a result, the size of the trial can be reduced from what we saw with the time to first event trial. And cost can be contained. This patient's clinical course is that of someone with multiple events. The recurrent events design recognizes each event, increasing that treatment effect with the higher number of events, and again, projected treatment effect is better, power is better, lower sample size, cost containment. But now let's look at an actual case study, and there are several out there. The one that we'll be looking at for the purposes of this discussion is the SHIFT study, Systolic Heart Failure with Ivabradine trial. Came out in 2010. I have the citations on the slide. And you can see here that if we compare the conventional time to first event trial design with the novel recurrent events design, we see that 44% of the heart failure hospitalizations were ignored in a time to first event design. 42% of the cardiovascular deaths were ignored in the time to first event design in this SHIFT trial. And if we look at the actual treatment effect, we see that we have an even better treatment effect with a better event rate when we added in the additional events on the right side of this slide. So you can see comparing the odds ratio of the first hospitalization to the odds ratio with multiple hospitalizations all being counted, the treatment effect is much better. So now, there are pros and cons, strengths and weaknesses to recurrent events analysis compared to a time to first events analysis. And I don't pretend to be a statistician, but these are all things that we need to at least be aware of. There's obviously that competing risk of death versus hospitalization. If a patient dies, they can no longer live to have that repeat hospitalization. There's also the clear fact that these events are not independent of each other. So someone who has that first heart failure hospitalization is going to be at greater risk of having a second heart failure hospitalization. And that's something that you can actually see in this slide. In cardiovascular disease, the best predictor of a cardiovascular event is the temporal proximity of the patient to a previous event. So let's state that another way. The event rate in heart failure is high immediately after the heart failure hospitalization and begins to decline gradually over the ensuing year. The same thing applies to acute coronary syndrome. The event rate is highest immediately after that acute coronary syndrome and starts to decline dramatically in the hours to follow and continues to decline over the next 1 to 2 years. Accordingly, patients after an initial event suffer a much higher risk than patients who have not yet suffered an event. However, the recurrent events analysis, it can account for that temporal distribution of events, as you see here, where the arrows graphically represent the time between events, each arrow with different lengths or time difference. So you can account for this temporal distribution, and that's one of the strengths of a recurrent events analysis. You're actually not just counting up the number of events, you are accounting for that temporal distribution of events. Now, another weakness that people would account for with a recurrent events analysis is the disproportionate look at a small fraction of patients accounting for a significant number of events in the trial. So they have a much more preponderance, a greater effect on the trial than the rest of the patients. But this can be looked at another way, because it's also true that these individuals that contribute disproportionately to the overall burden of events, they would be an appropriate target for more intensive monitoring and treatment. So you can actually identify a patient population who would benefit even more from this medication. So some key points crucial for prompt and expeditious acceptance by health authorities. You ultimately want regulatory approval of these agents that have clearly shown benefit, with a lower sample size, a greater treatment effect. But it's not just about trial design. These novel trial designs are best when supported by an evidence-based endpoint that can deliver multiple events and is clinically meaningful in the clinical course of the disease. For instance, if you look at a heart failure hospitalization, it's classically seen as a soft endpoint, soft meaning, but that can actually be argued, because if you look at heart failure hospitalization, it portends a downward spiraling in the overall clinical course of that heart failure patient. And by following the overall clinical course and natural history of that heart failure patient and monitoring each and every event and accounting for it, that will be important to payers and to patients and to their caregivers. Recurrent events design can mitigate for a low mortality trial and low event rates. You want to focus on endpoints and design features that will have an impact on patients and the healthcare system. This will be crucial for prompt and expeditious acceptance by health authorities. So oftentimes what will happen when you're dealing with this kind of a novel design, you'll end up having to create a much more complete, more succinct, more detailed briefing document for your health authorities. But if it is that complete, health authorities are generally accepting of a novel design that can have a similar, if not better, treatment effect with a lower sample size and can still show benefit with the endpoints that they're looking at. You clearly will have to argue for a soft endpoint like heart failure hospitalization if you want to include that, and you'll likely have to include the hard endpoint of cardiovascular death, and that can be argued. However, the recurrent events design is something, while novel, is being much more readily accepted by the health authorities than anyone would imagine. Just this year, the FDA, their statistical section, had a 2-day meeting. The first day almost entirely spent on recurrent events, and the preamble to the first to that conference was also spent entirely on a recurrent events analysis. So they're quite aware of this. They've been evaluating this and looking at it for several years now, and it's coming. It's a definite way that we can look at to continue to bring cardiovascular disease drugs to the market without increasing the sample size and yet still being able to show clinical benefit and need. Finally, you'd want to collaborate with leading global experts in multiple fields to generate these novel alternatives with the highest probability of acceptance. You obviously want to ensure that you've gone to statistical experts who are clearly well-versed in the recurrent events analysis and in cardiovascular outcomes trials, because they'll need to be able to account for the competing risk between death and the softer endpoints, or death and the repeated events such as MI and stroke. And now I'm going to turn it over to Chris Stanley.
Thanks, Tony. That was fascinating. So hello everyone, my name's Chris Stanley. I'm the VP of Trial Technologies here at Worldwide, and I've been lucky enough to participate in a wide range of eClinical technology products over the years, and I'm currently responsible for Worldwide's eClinical technology roadmap. So I'd like to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking to you about eClinical architecture. That is the ecosystem of vendors, systems, and infrastructure that we need to put in place to support the kind of innovative approaches that you've just been hearing about from Tony and meet the operational needs that Karen outlined earlier. So if we consider for a moment the nature diversity of systems that we need in place to deliver a large cardiovascular outcome study, it's relatively easy to start drawing some analogies between a cruise liner, as sophisticated and complex as the Queen Mary, and the clinical technologies. For example, we could consider the role of the systems on the ship's bridge to be analogous to the study CTMS, providing overall progress and management information to those steering the study. The ship's lookout is the equivalent of the drug safety and quality assurance functions, whilst the engine room driving the study forward is powered by the clinical data management and IRT systems. Indeed, the more we look at what it takes to deliver a truly successful cruise, the more it starts to resemble a clinical study. For example, the typical tea consumption on a Queen Mary cruise would fill an Olympic-sized swimming pool, whilst the annual wine sales will be in the region of 230,000 bottles. So I think the similarities are plain for everyone to see. In all seriousness, though, I think the key point here is that piloting the Queen Mary requires that all of the vast array of systems and subsystems, linked by miles of intricate wiring, work seamlessly together. Each crew member needs to be able to see the information relevant to their role when they need it, which enables them to apply their years of training and knowledge to give the clients the highest quality experience they possibly can. When it all works, the technology itself becomes almost invisible, the ship seeming to glide effortlessly across the world's oceans. As a CRO, we have to consider a further level of complexity. We're running not just one, but a fleet of ships, each subtly different. And what's more, each time we head out on a cruise, many of the ship's systems will have been upgraded or replaced. When we're considering technology, change is truly the only constant. And therein lies the greatest challenge. The ship is being constantly buffeted by the winds of a continuously evolving system landscape and the currents of the increasing intricacy, diversity, and volume of the clinical data we need to manage and collect. The end result can all too easily be a fragmented ecosystem of e-clinical technologies, which makes it hard or even impossible to maintain control, ensure compliance, measure performance, and maximize efficiencies. So before we look in a little more detail at some of the key trends driving that technological change in the clinical landscape, I'd like to spend just a few moments considering the very nature of technological change and the tricky business of predicting its impact. Isaac Asimov, the renowned science fiction author, made a stab at describing what our lives would be like today back in 1964. Now, you might assume that looking back, his projections fall into two categories, the ones that came to pass and those that didn't. He gets credit, for example, for anticipating self-driving cars, video calling, and the widespread use of nuclear power. And yes, he also got a lot wrong. He foresaw underground and underwater homes becoming popular, along with cars and boats that levitate on jets of compressed air. But many of Asimov's predictions also fall into a third category that you might not expect. Technologies that are indeed feasible today, but haven't yet become commonplace. For example, his dream of large solar power stations operating in the desert has been slow to arrive, as economic and political obstacles have taken time to overcome. The graph you can see on the right-hand side of this slide provides a conceptual representation of the maturity of emerging technologies through 5 distinct phases. In order, from left to right, the phases are a technology trigger. A potential technology breakthrough kicks things off and triggers significant publicity. However, commercial viability at this stage is generally unproven. We then move on to the peak of inflated expectations. All that early publicity produces a number of success stories. Some companies take action, however most don't. This in turn leads to the trough of disillusion. Interest wanes as experiments and implementations fail to deliver. Investments continue only if the surviving providers improve their products to the satisfaction of early adopters. And then on to the slope of enlightenment. More instances of how the technology can benefit the enterprise start to crystallize and become more widely understood. Second and third generation products appear, and more enterprises fund pilots. And finally, we reach the plateau of productivity. Mainstream adoption starts to take off. The technology's broad market applicability and relevance are clearly paying off at last. The clinical trials industry's adoption of new technologies is typically characterized by slower, incremental adoption, or by the application of technologies already proven in other industries. Technologies that have progressed steadily towards the right-hand side of the hype cycle, onto the plateau of productivity. Such caution is perhaps understandable, given the industry's long-standing history of mitigating risk in unpredictable outcomes, coupled with the relative conservatism of the regulatory authorities. So what I thought it would be interesting to do is to take as an example risk-based monitoring and conduct a quick poll here to see where the audience feels risk-based monitoring sits on the hype cycle. Is it at the start, the technology trigger, or has it moved on through the process to eventually reach the plateau of productivity? So if you'd like to vote now, we'll see what the audience's opinion is. So that's great. That's really fascinating. I think the message you can take from that is that just the sheer even spread of the responses across the whole life cycle of a technology is an indication of just how long it can take what many people would see as an established technology to infiltrate all the different areas of the industry. Now let's take a brief look at three of the most significant technology trends that are driving change in the clinical landscape. The image on the left, as I'm sure most of you will recognize, is taken from the 1999 science fiction film The Matrix. Towards the end of the film, when the film's main protagonist is suddenly able to see the swirling patterns of data that surround him and constitute the reality that he inhabits, in turn leading him to realize the immense power and insight that this affords him. Now, science fiction frequently reflects and amplifies real-world technology trends. In this case, we can see echoes of three significant trends which have already resulted in fundamental changes to society and commerce, and which are driving evolution in the clinical landscape. Firstly, network access is becoming ubiquitous. This always-on capability is transforming the entire study process. It facilitates streamlined and enhanced subject convenience through, for example, telemedicine and home care, reducing the need for outpatient visits. Improved recruitment using online on-site tools to find subjects and connect them with studies, then enroll them electronically, quickly and efficiently. Improved retention by providing a more interactive experience and reducing the burden of participation. Expanding the geographic reach of a study to include patients and sites that might otherwise have been unreachable or impractical to include. Secondly, the growing adoption of wearable devices and mobile apps. Wearables and apps frequently exist in a symbiotic relationship. Transforming patient interactions, they offer an evolution of traditional electronic data capture, extending the data capture ecosystem out beyond the traditional clinic or hospital setting and into patients' homes and workplaces, and providing another layer of monitoring for subject adherence and compliance. Take, for example, the iOS app, which provides an FDA-cleared EKG and lets subjects monitor their own blood pressure. The system uses the app and a variety of third-party hardware options, including an Apple Watch wristband, to provide on-demand heart monitoring and the ability to communicate results directly to the subject's doctor. The third trend is clinical intelligence and big data. A great example of this is the aggregation of diverse data sets, real-world information, claims, historical performance, along with predictive analytics to identify the right sites and staff efficiently and accurately during feasibility. Another is the potential to leverage available patient data when designing a study protocol and recruitment approach. What this serves to illustrate is that rather than worrying about trying to predict the next big thing, there are huge advantages to be gained by leveraging emerging new tools and technologies, including those already used successfully in other contexts. So given the complexities inherent in the clinical systems landscape and the evolving nature of the technologies, how should we approach implementing them in a way that ensures we provide the greatest benefits? Defining your eClinical architecture starts with organizational strategy identification. Once you've agreed on the strategy, you can assess how well your current systems, vendors, and processes support the key capabilities that are needed to deliver that strategy before putting in place a roadmap to drive future decision-making. Once the roadmap is in place, it drives the selection of systems and vendors that best align with your requirements and priorities. Close partnerships should be forged with vendors, with both parties standing to gain. Working closely with vendors enables deep integrations to be built between systems with comprehensive, effective master data management, allowing us to incorporate not just structured data from traditional sources, such as EDC and CTMS, but also semi-structured data from, for example, clinicaltrials.gov, or even unstructured data from Twitter and Facebook. This in turn results in operational efficiencies with single data entry and rapid propagation of data across systems. The objective is to achieve transparency of data to everyone working on the study, a single source of truth with real-time visibility into the data streams. Consistent and transparent data enables the implementation and tracking of comprehensive quality and performance metrics, all of which free staff to focus therapeutically on the patient journey through the study and on the areas of greatest risk to study delivery. It's worth noting that this process is cyclic rather than a one-off exercise. As the technology landscape shifts and evolves, the company's eClinical roadmap should be revisited periodically to ensure it remains aligned with the company's business strategy. One example of what such a properly implemented eClinical architecture can deliver is that the CRAs are specialists. Technology permits them to live in the data stream, spending more time not just monitoring data, but also for meaningfulness and gaining insights into novel interventions on patient care, transforming data and information into knowledge. The end result is technology that exists to service and empower CROs that highlight clinical acumen. The technology itself becoming almost invisible, the study seeming to glide effortlessly towards its final destination, much like the Queen Mary. So at this point, I'll hand back to Mike.
Thank you so much, Chris. What an incredibly interesting presentation, and so much for us to follow up on. But in the minutes that are remaining, I thought I would ask Karen, Tony, and Chris a couple of questions to get your point of view. So, Chris, well, are we at the right balance from your perspective? Technology adoption. Are we being too innovative and aggressive, or appropriately conservative? I guess I'm saying, where are you in the hype cycle?
Well, that's a fascinating question, and one that we spend a considerable amount of time debating between the different stakeholders within the organization and with sponsors who have differing perceptions of what level of risk associated with the adoption of a technology balances with what level of reward we get in terms of execution and delivery. But I think generally speaking, we are striking the right tone. There are definitely technologies which we are implementing and bringing to bear on these problems, which are having a significant impact on efficiency and transparency within the studies. And yet we're managing to do that in a controlled fashion that is managing any potential downside to patients.
Phenomenal. And Tony, I did want to ask you, when you first acquainted me with the recurrent events analysis, I said, that is so clinical. That's so clinical. That's the way physicians think about a patient. So, as you look forward, are you excited and intrigued by the implications as a cardiologist?
Oh, most definitely. I think this represents a new era in cardiovascular outcomes trials if it really takes hold, which it really appears to be, because of the ramifications on sample size and ultimately trial design and getting drugs approved. I mean, it's becoming more and more costly to get cardiovascular drugs to the point of health authority approval. By reducing the sample size, potentially reducing the trial duration because the sample size is lower, containing costs operationally, designing your trials better with better endpoints, getting those repeat events into the event rate to demonstrate that treatment effect that you know is there anyway, that really applies to the patient much more, because it really shows you the entire clinical course. That's what's important to physicians, to payers, and ultimately to regulatory authorities too, which is why they are allowing these types of novel designs to come in and be discussed. I think it's extremely interesting.
I was particularly fascinated, Tony, by the subgroups that one can see when you do the analysis. You know, it's the old story that a small percentage of patients really drive healthcare utilization. And so
It
your
does.
ability to look at the subgroups was a fascinating kind of offshoot of that approach.
Of course. But again, as I said, it's those patients that need the agent most. It's another way of looking at it.
And Karen, one final question. You know I have to ask you this. I mean, cardiovascular outcome studies are the poster child for working internationally. And I have never been so impressed as I see you guys work through the heterogeneity that exists as we attempt to execute these studies in so many countries. So what's been your experience over the years? Is that an opportunity or a real encumbrance toward operationalizing the trial?
Yeah, I think we have to embrace it as an opportunity. I think you know, sort of building off what sort of Tony has said about, you know, get these trials getting larger, even with some of the other ways that we can perhaps look at reducing sample sizes in the future. But also, I think it gives us the opportunity to get these, you know, these treatments out to that worldwide community. I think you know, we all need to think about those sorts of things in the future, and just the sort of saturizing some of the sites. I think we need to, you know, look at really sort of expanding that. And, you know, we've had some great experience with some of the Asia Pacific countries. There's some challenges or other challenges associated with them. You know, Russia, Georgia, Ukraine are still sort of an area that is classed as emerging, although we've been working in that region for probably more than 20 years now. But I think it's still sort of an underutilized area that we can get some great research out of.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our hour. I think we must agree that each of these presentations in its own right could serve as the basis for a separate webinar. I was just fascinated by all the implications of what's been discussed today. And certainly we'll consider that based upon your feedback. If you have any questions for us, please do submit them. We will, in fact, post our responses to your questions. Please do contact Lynn Letwith at the address indicated. If you wish to give us feedback or suggestions for our next topic. And on behalf of the entire team at Worldwide Clinical Trials who presented today, we thank you for your attendance and your interest.